Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 14, verse 12, which reads, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death." So the reason I wanted to look at this verse in particular is because, I feel like we live in an era of unprecedented personal autonomy. And what I mean by that is the defining moral philosophy of our culture right now is essentially this, right? Follow your heart, trust your instincts, live your truth, baby, right? But look, self-trust is not just permitted in our culture, it is literally celebrated. Right? The person who charts their own course, who refuses to be told what to do, who operates purely on their own internal compass is held up as the ideal of a fully realized human being, right? And, on the surface, it sounds liberating, right? But Proverbs 14:12 here, which you just read, raises a question that our culture almost never asks. And it is the most important question you can ask about any path you are on. Where does it actually end? Not where does it feel like it's going, not where do you intend it to go, where does it actually go? Right? Because Solomon's observation here is not that people choose paths they know they're wrong. It is that people choose paths that genuinely seem right to them, paths that feel correct, logical, justified, and reasonable, and end up somewhere they never intended to go. So that is a significantly more unsettling claim than a simple warning against an obvious sin, right? It is a warning against the limits of our own perception. So let's break down the verse here. There is a way that seems right to a man. So the word way is the familiar Hebrew word derek, the road or path we have encountered throughout the series. But what is striking about this particular usage is what modifies it. Not a way that is wrong, right? Or a way that looks appealing. No, it says a way that seems right. So the Hebrew word here, derek, carries the sense of being straight, correct, and morally justified in the eyes of the person traveling it. This is the detail that gives the verse its full weight. Because Solomon is not describing a person who knows they are doing something wrong and does it anyway. That is a real problem, yes, but it's a different one. He's actually describing a person who has genuinely evaluated their path and concluded that it is the correct one. Their conscience is clear. Their reasoning is sound, at least to them, but they are not suppressing guilt or ignoring warning signs. They are sincerely convinced that they are going in the right direction. And so this should give us pause here because it means the feeling of being right is not reliable evidence that we actually are right. You gotta understand, our internal sense of correctness is subject to the same limitations, blind spots, and distortions as everything else about us. In Jeremiah 17:9, he delivers the uncomfortable diagnosis underneath this verse. It says, I've actually referenced this passage before in this series, but it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" So the very faculty we are trusting to evaluate our path, our own heart and reasoning, is a faculty Scripture most consistently warns us not to trust in isolation. And, this is also where a critical misunderstanding of this verse needs to be addressed, because it would be easy to read Proverbs 14:12 as an argument against all human reasoning and decision-making, as if the lesson is simply never trust yourself about anything. But that is not Solomon's point either. Throughout Proverbs, he affirms the value of planning, discernment, and careful thinking. So the warning is not against using our minds at all, but it is against using our minds as the final and only authority on whether a path is right. So the problem is self-sufficiency in evaluation, not critical evaluation itself. Then even one of my favorite verses from the whole book in Proverbs 3:5-6, super popular, which we covered earlier in the series, is essentially the positive version of this same warning. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. And so the contrast is between a path you have determined is right through your own reasoning alone and a path that has been made straight by God because he brought him into the evaluation. which is what we should be doing. And so Proverbs 14:12 describes what happens when we skip that crucial second part. And then let's talk about this last part of the verse, right? Hey man, this is pretty scary right here. But its end is the way to death. The word end here in the Hebrew is asharit, which is the same word we encountered back in Proverbs 5:4 when describing the bitter end of the forbidden woman's path. Remember the context. The forbidden woman, is talking about a woman who leads you to temptation, right? And so it refers to the ultimate destination, the final outcome, the place the road actually terminates, regardless of what the traveler expected. And Solomon says that destination is death. And then the word death here is broader than physical mortality, right? What Solomon means here when he says death is that it encompasses destruction, ruin, and separation from the life and blessing of God. So this is the opposite of the abundant life that wisdom promises throughout Proverbs. But the sobering implication is that the traveler arrives there having genuinely believed they were headed somewhere else. So that's pretty crazy. In Matthew 7:13-14, we see the New Testament passage that most directly echoes this verse, and Jesus himself frames it with the same unflinching clarity. Enter the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So the wide road that leads to destruction is not populated exclusively by people who knew they were choosing destruction. It is populated largely by people who found the road easy and assumed that ease meant they were going the right direction. So this is perhaps the most penetrating dimension of the verse. The path to death does not always announce itself. It often presents itself actually as the path of least resistance, the most reasonably option, the choice that makes the most sense given your current values and understanding. But it's dangerous precisely in how unremarkable it can appear from the inside. For myself, man, gosh, like this, I struggle badly with this. I was just having a conversation with my dad the other day that for some reason, no, I shouldn't even say for some reason. I know the reason is because I'm just like this fool that Solomon is talking about sometimes, that I always choose the path of the least resistance. But no, that appeal is dangerous, and I need to use a great, massive deal of discernment. But man, the reason I'm saying that, guys, is if I were to sit here and act like I don't struggle with this deeply, I'll be lying. So I got to work on that too. But I actually also I want to say one more thing here, because it is also worth noting that this verse appears twice in Proverbs, almost word for word. Proverbs 16:25. Which we'll visit in a few videos, repeats it verbatim. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. The repetition is deliberate. When Solomon says something twice in a book, he is essentially putting it in bold. So this is not a casual observation, guys. It is a warning he considered important enough to state twice, which means we should consider it important enough to take twice as seriously. So now, again, like we always do in every video, let's get practical here. Let's get applicable here. Because I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important practices of our Christian life. So the first thing, right, is to build the habit of submitting our confident conclusions to outside accountability. I think the most dangerous moment is not when we are uncertain. Uncertainty naturally prompts us to seek input and move carefully, right? But the most dangerous moment is when we are completely sure we are right. That confidence is precisely where this verse is most relevant, because the person on the way that seems right is not doubting themselves. They are certain. And so practically, this means deliberately seeking out perspectives that might challenge our confident conclusions, bringing our plans to people we trust before executing on them, and maintaining a posture of genuine openness to correction, even when everything in us is saying we have already figured this out. Back in Proverbs 11:14, it gives us the structural solution. Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. And so the abundance of counselors is the practical antidote to the dangerous confidence of the man who thinks his ways always seem right. A second thing is to evaluate paths by their destination, not just their current feeling. One of the most practical skills wisdom develops is the ability to trace a path forward to its natural conclusion before committing to it. Most of the ways that seem right feel right in the present tense. They feel justified, reasonable, and appropriate right now, but wisdom asks a question that the feeling itself does not. If this path continues to its logical end, where does it actually arrive? And so this kind of forward-looking evaluation does not require pessimism or anxiety, but it requires the same kind of honest, clear-eyed thinking that a good navigator uses when plotting a course. Look, small directional errors at the beginning compound into major displacement over the distance. And so checking the destination before committing to the direction is not lack of faith. It is wisdom. And then the third thing here is to return regularly to scripture as the external standard of our internal compass needs. And this is what I mean by that, right? Since the core problem of this verse, Proverbs 14:12, is the unreliability of our own perception of rightness, the practical solution is a consistent, honest engagement with a standard that exists outside of our own reasoning, right? In Psalm 119:105, it describes scripture as a lamp to my feet and a light to my path, which is precisely the kind of external illumination, right, that exposes whether the way we are on is actually going where we think it's going. So this is not about checking a rule book before every decision. No, it is about forming the kind of mind and conscience that has been so thoroughly shaped by scripture that its instincts are increasingly calibrated to what is actually true rather than just what seems right in the moment. And so that kind of formation takes time and consistency, yes, but it is the long-term answer to the short-term danger that this verse describes. And so let me just give a closing thought here, right? Because Proverbs 14:12, the words we just read in that verse, it literally shows up again in Proverbs chapter 16. It's repeated twice in this book, and the repetition is really serious. Solomon did not double down on many observations, but this one he did, which means the tendency it describes, the confidence that our chosen path is correct, combined with the blindness to where it actually leads, is not a rare edge case. It is a common human experience that wisdom has to address more than once. And so this verse is not telling us that human reasoning is like worthless or anything, or that we should live in paralysis, afraid to make decisions. No, it is telling us that our reasoning needs something outside of itself to check against, that the feeling of being right is not the same as actually being right, and that the most consequential question about any path is not how it feels from where we are standing, but where it actually ends up taking us. So always keep in mind, guys, there's a way that seems right, but we have to check where it ends before we go too far down it, or else we can end up cooked.